They denied a black colonel's flight while he escorted a fallen soldier's remains. A colonel's mission to bring home a fallen comrade is derailed by prejudice, and the fallout comes quickly. But before we dive into what happens next, I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from today? Drop a comment below. Henry Graves stepped out of the cab, the gravity of his duty pressing down on him as heavily as the metals on his chest. The airport bustled around him, engines humming, wheels rolling, travelers hurrying past. Though the sun shone high over Virginia, Henry's mind was clouded with loss. In his hands, he held the paperwork needed to escort his fellow soldiers' remains home. This wasn't just any soldier. Private Nathan James had been his closest friend, a white soldier who had treated Henry like a brother through thick and thin. They'd laughed together, shared rations, and faced the same grim battles. When Nathan had fallen in a surprise attack overseas, Henry had sworn to personally return him home for a proper burial. Adjusting his uniform, Henry strode into the terminal. The afternoon sun reflected off his polished shoes and medals, symbols of his service, but he felt only the weight of his promise. Inside, people rushed to their gates, and the smell of coffee mingled with jet fuel from the runway. His uniform caught a few glances, but no one stopped him or acknowledged his sacrifice. This was nothing new. At the check-in desk, a young woman with a tight bun greeted him with a strained smile. "Ticket and ID, please." Henry handed her his ID and military documents. "I'm here to transport a military casket," he said softly. "Private Nathan James." The woman scanned the papers, her expression shifting from polite to wary. "You're the officer in charge?" she asked, as though surprised. "Yes," Henry replied calmly, feeling the familiar skepticism he'd faced before. She passed the documents back with a slight frown. "One moment, sir. I'll need to verify something." Turning to a colleague, she whispered something he couldn't quite hear, but the suspicion in her tone was unmistakable. Henry stood firm, waiting. Soon, a stern-faced employee approached him, sizing him up. "Colonel Graves, is it?" The man glanced at Henry's documents as if expecting them to vanish. "We need to run a quick verification." Henry clenched his jaw, holding back frustration. "Everything's in order. The family is waiting." The man looked him over with a flat expression. "I'll need to see your ID again," he said, ignoring Henry's uniform and medals as if they meant nothing. Without a word, Henry handed it over, and the man scrutinized it as though it might be fake. After a long pause, he returned it with a shrug but added, "We'll need to call security, just a precaution." Henry's heart sank. "Security? For what?" "It's policy," the man replied, his tight-lipped smile thinly veiling his doubt. Henry remained calm, though his patience wore thin. He watched as two security guards approached, one stocky with a shaved head. The guard eyed Henry suspiciously and asked to see his paperwork. Holding back his frustration, Henry extended the documents, explaining his mission. "It looks fine, but we'll need to take you for secondary screening," the guard said. "Secondary screening?" Henry repeated, disbelieving. "It's just protocol, sir," the guard said. Henry knew better. This wasn't about protocol. It was about asserting control, reminding him where they believed he stood. Swallowing his pride, he nodded and followed them to a small, sterile room away from the terminal. They ordered him to place his belongings on a metal table, and he unclipped his medals, placing them beside his friend's dog tag, a memento from Nathan's wife. The guards searched him methodically, even inspecting the folded flag he'd brought for Nathan's service. Once finished, they dismissed him without so much as an apology. Henry left the room, more determined than ever to complete his mission. Returning to the terminal, he checked the departure board and saw that his flight was delayed. Another setback, but Henry wouldn't be deterred. As he waited at the gate, a veteran approached him, having seen the exchange. Recognizing Henry, the veteran shook his hand and offered to help, ensuring the guards understood the importance of Henry's mission. With renewed resolve, Henry moved toward the cargo area, only to face more resistance from airport staff. But he wasn't giving up. Despite every roadblock, he promised himself that he'd see Nathan home, no matter what obstacles were thrown in his path. The delays and roadblocks had done little to shake Colonel Henry Graves' resolve, but as he finally reached the cargo area, the weight of the day settled heavily on him. Each obstacle had made him question not only the way he was seen, but the way his country still treated its black servicemen. Yet his focus remained unwavering. Nathan James's family was waiting, and Henry had a promise to keep. Steeling himself, Henry approached the supervisor in charge of the casket transport. She was an older woman with steely gray hair, who took one look at his uniform and the documents he handed her, and gave a solemn nod. "Colonel Graves, I've been informed about your mission," she said, her voice steady with respect. "I'll make sure Private James's casket is handled with the care it deserves." At last, Henry felt a glimmer of relief. "Thank you," he replied, his voice a touch softer. "It means more than you know." She nodded, signaling to her team, who began the careful transfer of Nathan's casket. Henry watched as they moved, each step executed with a level of precision and reverence that reminded him of the bond he'd shared with Nathan. They had been closer than brothers, sharing stories of their lives, of their families, and dreaming about a future beyond the battlefield. A future that Nathan would never see. The flight delay continued, leaving Henry ample time to sit in silence by the gate. The stares hadn't ceased, but he'd grown accustomed to them, tuning them out as he thought back on his friend. He remembered Nathan's laughter, his stories about growing up in a small town, and the way he had always stood up for Henry in the face of ignorance and prejudice. Nathan hadn't just been a friend, he'd been family, and Henry knew that were their situations reversed, Nathan would have done the same for him. After what felt like hours, the gate attendant called for military personnel to board first. Rising to his feet, Henry gave one final glance at the casket being loaded and joined the line. As he handed over his ticket, the attendant, a young man with an apologetic smile, looked him in the eye and said, "Thank you for your service, sir. We're honored to have you on board." Henry nodded, acknowledging the rare kindness with a slight smile. "Thank you." Settling into his seat, Henry felt the exhaustion of the day catch up with him. But there was also a sense of quiet victory. Against every obstacle, he was finally bringing Nathan home. He looked out the window, watching the airport fade into the distance as the plane ascended, carrying them both back to the people who loved them. When they finally touched down and the plane taxied to the gate, Henry's heart quickened. In a few short moments, he'd be able to hand Nathan back to his family. The doors opened, and Henry was the first to disembark, flanked by airline staff who guided him to the tarmac where Nathan's family waited, somber but resolute. Henry stepped forward, greeted by Nathan's parents and his young widow, who clutched their baby close. Her tear-filled eyes met his, and without a word, she placed a hand on his arm. He extended Nathan's dog tag, and she took it gently, her fingers tracing over it as if she could feel her husband's presence. "Thank you, Colonel," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Thank you for bringing him home." Henry placed a hand over his heart. "It was an honor. He was the best of us." As Henry stood alongside Nathan's family on the tarmac, the weight of his mission eased, yet a lingering sense of duty remained. Watching the tearful embrace of Nathan's widow and parents, he felt both the sorrow of loss and the quiet pride of fulfilling his promise. But deep down, he knew his journey wasn't quite over. He still needed to honor Nathan in a way that transcended the quiet ceremonies and symbols. Days later, Henry attended Nathan's funeral, a ceremony set beneath a vast blue sky, where military officials gathered to pay their respects. The sound of a distant bugle pierced the air as the honor guard folded the flag draped over Nathan's casket. Henry's hand was steady as he presented it to Nathan's widow, who looked at him with eyes that spoke of gratitude and pain. After the service, as mourners shared memories of Nathan, Henry quietly approached a small group of military leaders who had attended. It wasn't unusual for high-ranking officers to pay respects, especially for a decorated soldier, but Henry had a purpose in speaking to them. His time with Nathan had been a testament to the potential for camaraderie that transcended color and rank, but he couldn't ignore the barriers that still stood in the way of unity and respect in the military. One of the officers, General Whitfield, an older man with a distinguished air, turned to Henry as he approached. "Colonel Graves," he acknowledged, shaking his hand firmly. "Your friend was a remarkable soldier. The bond you two shared is something we should all strive for." "Thank you, sir," Henry replied, his tone respectful but direct. "Nathan and I, we saw each other as equals, as brothers. It didn't matter where we came from. But during this journey, I faced prejudice that no man in uniform should ever face. This isn't just about me. It's about honoring every soldier who serves, no matter their background." The general's gaze softened, a flicker of understanding passing over his face. "It shouldn't have to be said, Colonel, but you're right. Sometimes even the uniforms we wear don't shield us from judgment." With a slight nod, Henry continued, "Nathan's legacy is the brotherhood we shared, but to truly honor him, and others like him, we need to do more. I'm asking that the military leadership take steps to address these issues, not just in words, but in actions." General Whitfield looked at Henry thoughtfully. "It sounds like you're calling for a change, Colonel Graves. If you're serious, there's an initiative in Washington aimed at examining and addressing racial bias in the military. I'd be honored to recommend you to sit on the advisory board." Henry was taken aback. He hadn't expected an invitation, but he knew this was an opportunity to effect change in Nathan's honor. He shook the general's hand once more. "Thank you, sir. I accept." Over the coming months, Henry's life changed. He found himself in meetings with high-ranking officials, speaking before committees, and recounting his experiences, not just for himself, but for every soldier who had faced similar struggles. Nathan's story became a beacon in their efforts to push for equity and respect within the ranks. And every time Henry looked at Nathan's dog tag, which he now carried with him as a reminder, he felt his friend's presence urging him forward. Leave a comment if you enjoyed this story. It doesn't cost you anything and you'll make me very happy. Thank you, and I look forward to your like.